Well, Steve, we're here to pull it all together. We've had multiple workshops and we've used Otter to look at all those workshops, and now we want to provide people with the juicy stuff. What it is that we came away with and what it is that we think we have discovered in our journeys. This is what the 100 and I've stopped counting now after 118. We've had a lot of meetings.
Too many, but we've got an enormous amount done despite it.
we have, and to recap, we had two different sets of workshops. You had a set on marketing, but you focused on newsletters,
Correct.
and I had a set on, for lack of a better term, store design, or specifically what you do in your physical displays to engage. And we'll save the best for last, but we ended up with some really interesting connections. We invited people in, and we had people attending, and then you did some wonderful work pulling all this together and synthesizing what happened. So you
Thank
want
you. I'm still buried in ideas and thoughts and notes and
to well,
documents.
I think you've treated it like dough. Thanks to Otter, we got all of the conversations, and we used our AI capabilities and pulled out. And it was interesting that the AI kind of matched up with our original intent and some of the key points that we were thinking we would make. But we also discovered things along the way. So
Yeah, and
our intent here is to talk about them. Yeah.
we drew on a cohort, so to speak. I used to be uncomfortable with the word cohort. Now I love it. So we drew on a cohort of 30 bookstore principals and managers, as well as a few other people. And each time we would have 5 to 20 people, depending on the way the winds were blowing. But it was really valuable to listen to people. On mine, I always had a guest. I had the marketing director from Heyday Books, where I'm on the board chair. We had Andrew Kessler, who has an agency called the Article Group. And then the last one, we had Mike Manella, my partner and former partner from um, Campfire, which is a company that came out of the Blair Witch Company or film. And
He was
he was
really
great.
interesting.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. They
We
were all great.
I highlighted. I had lots of, by proxy, lots of people, lots of bookstores in the room, because I had lots and lots of pictures of people doing things and these ideas. Plus, we had people trying things in the workshop. So our intent here, I think, is to have a conversation, record it so that we're capturing the key things that we got out of each set of workshops, and then pulling together those nuggets that we got as a result of both of them. So.
So let's do what we talked about, which is we'll start with narrative design or store design, and and how you make a store magic, to use a weak word. And I'll interview you about that because you're the world-class expert in narrative design in stores. And then we can move on to marketing and newsletters, which
Yeah,
I have a few random opinions about. Um,
random.
Random. It's always random. Bohemian opinions, maybe. So why don't you talk for a minute and explain to me? I'm curious about just sort of the overall theme that we've developed around personality for a store. How and why you develop a personality for a store.
Well, I think it's a great question, because what I got from your workshop was this whole idea of persona, that the store is an entity. And I've always been saying that the shelves and the displays are like bones. They're an entity, and that the books on them are nerve endings. They're alive.
Mm.
It's a bookshop, a good store of any kind, but a bookshop especially should feel like it's just pulsing with energy when you walk in. And it's all about narrative. And the reason we talked about narrative display or narrative design is that we wanted to pull those narratives, real stories, real people's stories, into the display in some way. Um, and that was what we were exploring. And I think it's a concept, at least I haven't heard anybody else talking about. So in this sense, our work with Beyond Bookstores kind of hits this area that nobody else is talking about. This, you might think of it as an advanced concept, because we didn't talk so much about the fundamentals of color flow or of pyramiding or of positioning, but we got a little more, we got a little more granular, a little more earthy in saying, just like James Dawn has done with Barnes and Noble and getting booksellers involved and putting things together, we want the actual store to reflect the narratives of the customer themes, as well as the narratives from the people themselves, the booksellers themselves.
And don't you think that the principle there, there's a couple principles. One is a marketing principle, which is you're always trying to make people curious about what you're selling. So
Absolutely.
curiosity is a really big part. And then curiosity is satisfied in a way by stories. What you do, let's talk about store display as a browsing experience. When I was living in Brooklyn and I was on a Sunday and I finally had some time and I was looking for something to do, I'd walk up the street to a great bookstore we used to have up there, and I just walk around and look at books and pick things up. And there would sometimes be an author talking, but it was a place to hear and find stories. And I'm curious what you think, but I'm always arguing that bookstores should not be organized by category, which drives up bookstore owners crazy, because that's what it's sort of like saying a car should not have four wheels to them. And but if I walk into a bookstore and I see, oh, there's sci-fi, there's self-help, there's history, there's politics, whatever, fiction, nonfiction, I'll go to the section I'm interested in and ignore 90% of the store. And when I get there, mostly I'm looking at spines of books. So there's nothing there that's going to tell
Yeah.
me anything about the stories that are all stacked there one by one. And so I'm also, a fan of what Daunt does, which is have James Daunt, which is to have tables that are waist level, and you look at a whole collection of books that you can't even figure out why they're all put together, but they do tell a story about the story of each one in some way that's much more attractive than the usual way of doing that.
Well, when we talk about pulsing, that's what we're talking about, the life that somebody gives it. And you mentioned a couple of principles. Waist high display is something that works, and people look down. They used to call it the phone position, because you'd hold your phone and people look down, and it's an emotional position. So when you're positioning something face up and you have to look down for it, you're kind of emotionally engaged when you're looking at something. And we talked about some of those kind of ahas that we tend to think in compartments and put things in under compartmental labels. But when we think in themes, a theme is much different. And one example from last weekend, I was in Denver and got to present with Mountains and Plains and talk about this subject. And we were talking about the difference between a theme and a topic. I asked them to give me their really awful beleaguered displays that were just sitting there sloth like. And one of them was one that just said empowered women. And we discussed as a group what made that so flat. And it's because it's really not about anything. But if you say her hair fell out and then this happened, I mean, you've created a theme, you've created something really interesting, something relatable, something specific. And this, I think the big learning, and spoiler alert, I think in your workshop, which was marketing newsletter, and in my workshop, which was about narrative display, is that they were really about the same things,
Yeah, yeah,
about
yeah.
engaging people in scintillating, sexy, interesting stories that meet them where they are, and saying it in a way that makes people want to know more.
Yeah. Yeah, it's a really good point, because like when I was in London in February, I went to Daunt's Marylebone bookstore, and almost out on the street is a big round table with a bunch of books that, wait a minute, they're not on sale. They all have great covers. Somehow they've been chosen for the covers. They're lying there, and there's a book of fiction, there's a Joan Didion, there's a this, there's a that. And the only connection is there's some sort of, like you said, pulse coming at me, and it drew me into the store. Well, if you do a newsletter and you start out with, we're going to have, the latest book from a famous author who's traveling around the country doing the same presentation at every bookstore, and I'm reading
Mhm.
it online. That's like the door is closed. I'd rather you start out by saying, I was coming to open the store, and a guy came up to me and I thought he was going to rob me. And in fact, he wanted to give me 100 books, whatever it is, you know.
Yeah, something that's really, really original. And what you were saying, and I think it's impossible for us to talk about this as disconnected, because in your newsletter workshop, which you focused on, what was it that made you focus on newsletters from a
I thought that's a really good question. I thought, what are the basic context we're dealing with, you and I, and in the couple of years we've been talking to bookstore owners, and you're a bookstore owner yourself now. Nobody has any time. It's in their mind, they're going to go out of business if they don't finish what they have to do today.
Mhm,
And
mhm.
so when you say to them, "Oh yeah, let's get you on TikTok and we'll and book talk," and you're like, "I haven't got any time to figure that out. Do that," is the answer always. But they are doing newsletters. Almost every bookstore has a newsletter. Every bookstore has a store. Practically everyone. And so those are two things that people can deal with and adjust slowly in baby steps if they want and fix.
And what was the big, so you chose newsletters as a basic building block. Um, but the larger marketing context and your marketing bias came through, and especially through the three guests that you had on. What what were the big takeaways? What were some of the big things that we learned about the newsletters? And
Well, that they should be part of your personalizing your store, branding your store. And your store should come out of you and your staff's own um, preferences in books, stories you're interested in. I
Mhm,
mean, one of the greatest bookstores in the world that you and I've talked to a number of times is City Lights in North Beach in San
mhm.
Francisco, which is the great beat generation. Well, that is the most carefully curated bookstore only because they just pay attention to what they're interested in. They don't, you could go in there and ask for a James Patterson book and they won't even know who James Patterson is.
Mhm.
And so
A
part
much
part of
beloved writer, but
a much beloved writer. We love James Patterson. Nothing
yeah,
personal, James.
yeah.
um, and so what we've been saying is the bookstore and the newsletter, which by the way, we'll get to this eventually. One of the great discoveries is how they could work together, but they both have to catch your attention immediately. That's always the thing with marketing is what's the headline, you know,
I
and so the newsletter cannot start out with, oh, here is the list of books we're going to have the authors talk about, or we just got in 5 books from the. Everybody's saying that. How about like Jill Hendricks, who was on it, talked about her love of roller coasters at the beginning, and then she got to the point that running a bookstore is like a roller sitting on a roller coaster, and so
is
she personalized it in terms of she took the weakness in some ways of being a bookstore and so vulnerable during the pandemic and turned it into a great story.
Yeah. And to your point, if we think like storytellers, if we think there's a lot of editing involved and there's a lot of personalization involved. I think as a publisher and as someone who's been in making movies and making, telling stories for decades, a lot of the things that are salient to being a good storyteller came out in this workshop. Would you agree?
Yeah, absolutely. I
Yeah.
mean, what's fascinating sometimes, like in the movie business, is to look at what the first 2 minutes of a movie is. What are they? Because we had my old film school had Colin Young, who was quite fabulous, used to say you establish your conventions at the beginning. You got to grab people at the
Mhm.
beginning, and you also establish the context you're in, how you're going to
So
tell the story.
you encouraged us in the newsletter, and I was among them because I tried it myself and did this for our bookstore bookshop. Um, and I told a personal story about my grandmother and kind of the whole name of Plenty, which is our bookshop, and how her post depression era generosity inspired this idea of a life of plenty and all of that. it was fun for me telling that story, and it led to something, kind of an understanding that while I'm over here talking about narrative and display, that what's in the newsletter needs to show up in the store and invite people to participate in other ways too. So I found it really interesting because a lot of times we segment. We've got one person who's over here buying books, and they're doing it in a vacuum late at night, or in the store during the day, but still in a vacuum. You got one person over here doing the newsletter, and you got another person, or even divided head in one person who's going, I'm not doing the newsletter right now. I'm doing a display. And so when I go to do a display, I use a different mind than when I'm buying books or telling a newsletter. And I think your perspective, or maybe our aha, was that all three really need to be connected
Yeah.
all the
Yeah.
time.
It's interesting because the book business and bookstores are the most segmented, divided kind of business in the world in a way, because you've got these extraordinary stories, thousands of them sitting on shelves.
Mhm.
You've got different people in the bookstore who have different approaches to working with the customers. You have different segments, you could be over in the kids section, or you could be in self-help or whatever. And then the newsletters usually have 5 or 6 different sections. Here are the new books. Here are the authors who are going to appear. Here's an event we're going to do, et cetera, et cetera. And then you have bookstore owners and staff who are stress out, underfunded, and struggling to pull all this stuff together. It's crazy. It's
It
amazing we
it
have as many bookstores in this country as we do that survive.
well, what I loved, my big aha in this process, watching everybody, listening to everybody talk, listening to you talk, was that, and Ashley, my store manager, and I got together afterwards, and we're trying to be super coordinated so that the story we're telling in the newsletter and our Life of Plenty podcast and what they find in the store and what we order for the store, and what our board knows about, because we're a nonprofit, are all the same thing. That,
Yeah.
this month we're working on one thing, one type of story, one kind of, and to pick that one thing and to be focused. We have so many activities. It's just really easy to get lost in the rain of transactional processes. Here are all the books, and here are all the events, and here are all the, and it just becomes noise. So
Yeah.
if we have a
Meanwhile,
connected,
somebody like me walks in and to my local bookstore at Copperfields and says, "My grandson, who's 8, is heavily into sci-fi," and the woman who works there said, "Great." She's this young woman. She writes out a whole series of series that I should buy from someone to buy a whole series.
yeah,
She sells me 30 books. I give to him, and he's like amazed. How did I know
yeah.
about that? Somebody cut through.
Well, and that's the other thing, is the personalization of this. Is a professional bookseller is someone who is like a counselor, like a, I just read the book and set in Japan, and I'm gonna mess up the title, but it was Everything I Need is in the Library, Everything You Need is in the Library, something like that. Um, Let me have it here. Here it is. What you're looking for is in the library. Um, and
Hmm.
it's and the story is of a librarian who does exactly what Copperfields did for you. She wrote down all these things, and then people discovered a book that they would. And what's interesting in this book is that in addition to what they're asking for, she always includes one book that they're not expecting, that comes from a totally different genre, totally off of the beat. And that is the book that is the catalyst for their growth every time. And it's sort of an intuitive art, uh, that is beautiful to watch. And that's what we expect of professional book selling. So when we were talking about narrative design, and when we were talking about newsletters, we're really talking about the same thing:
Hmm.
telling a good story, and then being present to make that come alive.
Yeah. Do you and then a bunch of other things like going back to store design, you know, um, uh, designing a store that's going to lead you through, almost need a heat map to figure it out. That's going to lead you from one section to another, and the sections aren't things that I'm not interested in. They are, namely, displays of books that'll intrigue me, as opposed to
Well,
mysteries,
yeah,
sci-fi, but talk about the Museum of One. I think that was a really interesting concept in terms of display.
well, the idea of a museum, period, is that a museum takes you on a journey, right? Uh,
Hmm.
you go, you go on a journey to learn about the life of a community, or the life of a people, or the life of a person, or the life of an animal, or something. But you go on a thing, and this museum of one is this idea of taking one person and looking at what interests them. And in the way we mentioned, Dawn has done that with booksellers and said, and you did that too. You're like, these are the books that speak to me and have shaped me. And because they're coming out of your head and your experience, they hold together in a unique way. Um, in our little store, we used a local celebrity type who happens to make great cheese displays. He's known as the he is the king of cheese, and a quite interesting fellow. And he pulled in everything from personality styles to the kinds of baking books that shaped him, things that he loved, and it was and you could find them not only in one display but throughout the store. You could follow Diego's House of Cheese throughout the store, and it became kind of a museum journey that went through health and every part of the store, which is segmented by genre and by topic. So we've got the BISAC categories, and we've got a librarian that works with us, and she's very satisfied when things are in their proper categories. um, but breaking those category walls down is our other challenge, and a museum of one can do that, because really, as people, we touch all of these categories at
But
different times.
the idea is that you might chronicle some local, like even the local mortician and his
Yes.
history of previously he took pictures of everybody in town and he was the town photographer. Now he's the mortician. You
Yeah.
might, and then you might have some of his artifacts as well,
Yeah.
not from the mortuary, thank you, but
Yeah.
you might have some of his artifacts from his
I,
history and his family there,
I'm
as well as books that relate.
I'm so glad you mentioned artifacts. Sherry Staunch on Main Street Reads was in our workshop, and she does a beautiful job now of incorporating artifacts from her very interesting life and pulling them in, and they're unique. She's in the Guinness Hall of Fame, Guinness, I don't know, world records somewhere. She's a champion of billiards, for instance. And
Yeah,
what an interesting background. And she pulls things into her display and into her store that only she could have brought there, that
yeah.
could only be in that one place. It gives it a sense of place and of person. And and I think that's what we wanted in the newsletter, and it's what we wanted in the store. And it's like you are.
We need an IT guy. Whoa. I will pause it here. I'll say to the editor, which happens to be me.
Talking about the integration of local elements.
Hold on 1 second there. Okay. What'd you say?
We were talking about Sherry and the integration of local elements, how she
Yeah.
brought in things from her life that gave it a sense of person and place. And I think that's only one part. Yeah.
Hold on 1 second. I'm going to pause it again. Um, yeah. Do you want to pick it up with talking about something I'm still curious about, which is white space?
Yeah. I mean, one of the things that Mike Manello really brought to the fore is the importance of white space. And what he meant there was, if I understood it correctly, and you're an expert, this opportunity for people to participate with you. So creating literally space for them to create something or add something to the piece of paper, as if it's a white piece of paper. That's at least what I took away from it. And
Yeah, yeah. No,
Sherry, yeah, yeah,
we used to say at our old company, Mike and I, that or Mike used to say you need to tell a story that people want to retell, not tell a story that people appreciate and they're silent.
yeah. So they want to retail or want to be part of. And Sherry Staunch at Main Street Reads grabbed this concept during our workshop, and she had a thing that she did in her newsletter and in social media. and it was simply about your favorite summer read. But she created a white space, an opportunity for participation, and then she followed it with a display in her store that was like it had a QR code and it was big favorite summer reads, and she stocked with the summer reads, which to your point are books that aren't related by genre. They're just simply people's favorites and interesting on that basis. So that's a very light and easy, accessible version of you can go deeper with that idea, but I loved what Sherry did and just in creating interaction, you know.
Yeah, yeah. And one of the keys there is contrast. So, like the books on the table at the Marleybone store in London of Daunt's, you'd go like, why is that book with that book? And that actually made you pay attention because you were confused and you're curious. You'd start looking at each book.
Yeah.
And actually we'll cut into this and we'll show some visuals, but there's a couple of examples from that store where you see just two books, multiple copies of two different books that you have no idea why they're together.
Well, the beautiful example that you created, Steve, and on in from your own library, you took a picture and created a beautiful example of books coming together in different ways for different purposes, and it's got to make you curious. One of the things that we said that signage and being careful about um, uh, titles that bring people in. So the white space idea. So instead of saying great writing tools, I have a display about, writing tools. I changed it to what's your story,
Yeah,
and which is more inviting. And the
yeah,
idea that everybody's got a story and here are some tools to tell yours. And that was the kind of thing. Mike Manella was really great about, kind of getting in with people and inviting them to play. The everything from the cosplay that we see, at conventions to, um, and here's an example. We're having a midnight book release party kind of thing. It's a white space. People are supposed to bring some things and do it sold out within an hour for our little bookshop. Because it's unusual, it's at an unusual time, it involves them, they've got to bring something to the party. It's kind of fun that way. So
yeah. There's a great cemetery in Brooklyn. I see keep coming back to these kind of ghoulish things. Boy, there's a cemetery in Brooklyn, a huge
we're
one.
we're, we're taping this in October, so maybe you're feeling a little ghoulish.
Yeah, I'm thinking Halloween. Um, where they constantly are doing events, sort of Halloween like mystery events. And people come and there's all sorts of mysteries you have to follow and find certain tombstones. And it sells out constantly. It's very hard to get in.
So,
Um,
so the nuance here, because it sounds like we're talking about things that bookstores are already doing. They're having events, they're inviting people, but to be really deliberate about the invitation and making that invitation play all the way through your newsletter, all the way through your social media, into your displays, into your store, so that everybody's in on it.
yeah.
Everybody's doing it. Um, and storytelling and display shows up a lot of different ways. It shows up like a good theme, a narrative that you're starting, a conversation starter, or it shows up like a museum of one, like we were talking about. And and the newsletter marketing. What were you surprised by in the newsletter marketing, or how did that white
Well,
space end up showing up, or did it?
um, I think that it is very new to bookstore owners to be told, tell your story. A lot of times people who start bookstores are very quiet and sit in the corner and read a book. They don't think about writing a book or telling a story, but that's what they've got to do. And it's fascinating because most of the people who participate are women, not men. I mean, we had Brad Jones from Booksmart and Bargain Hill and a few others, but mostly are women. And women are much more thoughtful and emotional, in my opinion, my humble opinion. You'll have to tell me uh, about telling stories. They don't just brag and tell stories like that. They tell stories that are much more personal if they do. And I think
Yeah.
that is part of the reason why they're bookstore owners and part of the reason they need to be drawn out
Hmm.
because I want to go to there was a great mystery bookstore in New York when I lived there. You just went in and you wanted to talk to the guy behind the counter and say, well, like not only what book should I buy, what mystery? I've read all of Raymond Chandler, I've read all of Dashiell Hammett, but what's next? But
Mhm.
you want to say, how did you start this store? Was it, a great example is the great British Bake Off
It's a
show.
great Miss Baking show. Yeah.
Yeah, yeah. Where we were just watching it again last night, and they have a new season. And you have all these people who are brought in, who in their own way are telling a story through their dish that they're making, or their bakery item, and and the challenge of time and all that, which just makes it much more fascinating to see if they're going to make it in time. And then you're sitting there, my wife and I were sitting there saying, we should bake that, and then we should do this, and we could do this. And it's like an unpackaging when you unbox something online.
Right.
You go
Right.
like, well, I want to get that, and I want to take that out of the box. I don't care what's in the box. It's about the unboxing. And
It's
and
the
so process behind the scenes for bookstore owners to talk about. And we talked a lot about that at our in our cohort on newsletters, and I think people were encouraged to do more of that. Brad, the same guy, Brad, he has a very small store in this very small town in California, and he does book author events, unless it's somebody quite famous that draws a big crowd, out on the sidewalk. He can't do it. He doesn't have room in the store, so he doesn't have a sidewalk. Mostly in the warmer months, I'm sure.
Mhm.
But then what happens is people are walking by, and he talks about how they're even driving by, and they go, what's that? What's going on there? And they stop and they come and they go in. And he tells the authors, your job is to catch people's attention, stop them and talk about your book. And in fact, get them to come in the store and buy one, and then look around and buy something else.
Well, and you're kind of hinting at, going to the culture where they are. And I think pop culture integration was one of the things
Yes.
that you talked about in the newsletter, that was talked about in the cohort. You want to talk about that?
Yeah, Andrew Kessler, who runs the Article Group, a really terrific agency that's growing like leaps and bounds. He talked a lot about how you have to be on trend and be watching what's going on in the culture. And he doesn't necessarily mean Trumpism or something like that. He means much more esoteric, kind of interesting stuff that people are fascinated by. And that you need to translate some of what you're doing in the store and some of what you're offering into that same appeal. If in my neck of the woods, we talk endlessly about gophers and how to beat gophers, because we all have property, an acre of property, and these
Hmm.
damn gophers are running around ruining everything. So there are classes in gophers. So how about doing that at a bookstore? Say, we have a lot of gardening books, but we also have some interesting one about how to deal with pests. And
How
should
to deal with
you
gophers. Well, to Mike Manello said, in one of our workshops, that people come to the bookshop to make a memory. They come to have a conversation. They come to, and I'm often asking people, what would make somebody lay their phone down, get off of their couch, get in their car, drive across, or walk around town and go to a bookshop. And 80% of people haven't in the past decade. So when we talk about pulling more people into this world of book culture, pop culture integration is important, because meeting them where they are. I think Kelly Justice said it, being less precious about who we are, and really thinking in terms of what is the public seeing, and what do they care about, and being a little more broad with our newsletters and our displays.
Yeah, and I talked about a campaign a friend and I did for the local art center, where we, instead of selling local and showing local painters in the gallery, what we did is we got a bunch of wealthy collectors to contribute, um, just for showings purposes, unfortunately, and they didn't give them to us. Picasso's, Miro's,
Hmm. Hmm.
Mapplethorpe's, etc. But the posters that we put up for it all said something like, the strategy was that something like, your neighbors have been hiding something behind closed doors. And it played on the idea that they didn't want you to see their pictures because you might break into their house and steal them. Or there were others that were much more sexy. But the idea was, there was a whole series of them that, that your neighbors are up to something that you haven't
Yeah,
known about,
you're
and
not
we're
going to
going to
believe what your
show
neighbors are hiding. I think
them.
you said
Yeah, yeah,
one
yeah,
of them. It's really
yeah,
good. I love that, and as we kind of move to combined strategies that emerged with this marketing, which we think of as an external act, and with the display, which we think of as an internal act, we discovered that really they're very connected, and I want to talk a little bit before we close about some of the combined strategies that we saw. I mean, one of them that you were just talking about is just this experimental mindset, this idea that it's a laboratory and you're experimenting as you go with how audiences respond to certain uh, interesting, scintillating tape. Like you're not going to believe what your neighbors are hiding, or something.
yeah,
Yeah.
exactly.
You could do the same thing with books. You could say, you're not going to
Yeah,
believe what your neighbors are hiding. What are
yeah.
the books? Can you guess the books? That would be a fun
Or
thing.
you're not, you can't believe probably what authors are saying.
Yeah.
Um,
Yeah.
yeah, no, there's a local, just to stay in the gardening theme, there's a
Yeah.
local nursery here that's the smallest of all the nurseries, but it's the most like an anthropology store, which, by the way, I love those stores because they were designed to take you on a journey. There were French antiques and stuff. But anyway, um, this store runs very small, almost single word ads in the local paper, the Press Democrat, which still costs them a lot of money. And yet, and it's the smallest one, it gets the most attention because they're just one word. So they'll have one that says taxes. You go like, what's it? What? And you'll go like, you can donate to this or you can buy this. But if you come into our store, we'd have a special off, because of of the nonprofit we're working with. Or it'll say, just go back to my theme today. It'll say death. And you say, what? It's just block letters death. You read the fine print. It's a very small ad. It says, are your plants dying? Come in.
I love it.
We're
Yeah.
we're
Yeah.
experts at what's wrong with your plants. We can diagnose it. We have all the great
Yeah.
fertilizers and all that. And I
Well,
have
and yeah. Go
no, and it
ahead.
goes to what's something that that was very famous from Virgin Atlantic. The founder Richard Branson, the founder of Virgin Atlantic, said, "Listen, I had to step out of my category in order to raise my profile. My airline, British Airlines, was number 6, not number 2 after the big, Kahana was British Air. And then next came Virgin. No, I'm number 6. But what I did is I said, I'm no longer an airline, I'm an entertainment device. And he created all these great lobbies and his airport his locations, and the planes were entertaining. And he moved himself way up.
I think that is a beautiful story to tell and a beautiful illustration of the combined strategies that we're talking about. Because Richard Branson and what he's done with the brand, that cohesive brand, and being very intentional about the brand as a persona. It's
Yeah.
it thinking about your store. You introduced the idea of persona, and I've been thinking about who my store is. I often say it's Dolly Parton and Mr. Rogers had a baby in Switzerland, and that is the store. So, uh, but I think it's helpful to think about persona and think about the store as outside of, you just said it, outside of the normal genre, outside of the industry that you're
Step
in.
out of your category. You're not just a
Step out of your
library. You're
category.
not a cat. You're not a library. You're
And
not, this is not the Dewey Decimal System.
and I think that's the biggest and best thing that we discovered. We were putting one underscore thing, I would say, for me at least, it was this idea that a lot of our very best ideas are going to come from other spaces that we enjoy tremendously.
Which goes right to community partnerships that we've talked a
Yeah.
lot about. And
Yeah.
Kelly, I think her last name is Strongberg, who's in Kansas City and has basically a portable bookstore, if you will.
Uh-huh.
Um,
Yeah.
she goes to hip hop events and takes books that she thinks are relevant for that around music. She'll go to a flea market that's for automobiles and bring automobile books. So she's figuring out the personas of her audience and aiming her selection each time at that. And she's in some ways the most advanced guard in terms of an
Well,
independent bookstore.
she inspired me, and what I've got a person working just on business to business relationships of books now,
Mm.
and And just in my block, I've got, a person who's a store that's all about decorating and house making. And we want to supply them with books. Next door, I've got a one about camping and outdoor adventure. Supply them with books. We got two doors down, a beautiful plant store that I think is very analogous. We've been on the plant theme today, with the reason people go into that plant store because they want to be growers. If they were confident growers, they'd be at the nursery, but they're at the plant store. They need somebody to hold their hand and take them and assure them that there is a plant that they cannot kill this week, or that they will be guided. And similarly, people who come into a bookstore, a small one, they're looking for curated browsing. They're looking for a browse experience and that handhold experience that they're going to get both in the shelves and with a person who leads them to a book or leads them to that book discovery and helps them find it. So thinking outside of the box, and well, to your point, I'm going to put books in the plant shop, books in the coffee shop, books in these different places that are an extension of the store experience, and that then again draw people in. So that to me was a very interesting idea, is to think outside of your own category or
And,
box.
and the fact that you're an entertainer, you know,
You're an entertainer.
you're on
That's right.
stage. You may hide at the back of the store, but people are eventually going to look to you for answers, and they're going to look to your store for entertainment.
You are going to make a memory, and we are adding value. Speaking with Phil Oleum of Ingram, he's the one of the chief staff at Ingram, and been in the book business a long time. And I asked him, I said, Phil, what would you do if you could wave a magic wand and help bookstores? And he said, I would get rid of receiving, and I would get rid of the checkout, and I would focus all the attention on making memories in the middle. Because, just like you go and pay for a really nice meal, and you expect a certain kind of service and a certain kind of, some things that come with that meal. If you go into a bookshop, you expect a different kind of experience, an elevated experience, or at least a really different one, you know, a really
Well,
unique one.
there's a reason that waiters justify high prices in fancy restaurants by explaining all the elements that go into each dish that you ask about.
That's
And
right.
even though we all go, oh, here we go again, we all really want to hear it.
If you say this was farmed fresh in soil that was made rich by,
Yeah, was
mining
walked
this
upon by
lake and
George Washington
walked
Carver.
upon.
Yeah.
And we laugh, but we love those stories. And those stories make things taste different. And those stories make the stories we tell in our newsletters, in our marketing, in person to person, and in our displays are what make the soil rich.
Yeah.
And those are the stories that make us interested in books. And today anybody can order a book any minute of the day, as long as they're holding a phone in their hand. Um, and we don't like that. We want them to come to the bookstore. But if we're really going to get them in the bookstore, we got to offer them something that they can't get from their phone in their hand.
Well,
Um,
if they have the phone in their hand, they have a specific book they're checking up on and they see it on Amazon.
yeah.
That's not the browsing experience that a bookstore
Not the browsing
provides.
experience. That's a transactional experience. And
Yeah.
I think one of your points in the newsletter is that too often we're thinking in transaction. Here's a list of books,
Yeah.
and and here's what's going on with a list of books. That's different than telling a story that's rich and personal,
Yeah.
and it's like Richard Branson did, getting out of your lane and telling. It's a really good thing. We should wrap this up because otherwise it's going to be very long.
Yes.
So
We're gonna have to edit it too much.
that's right.
All
But
right.
we've learned so much, and I think we could keep going. And I really appreciate all of the unique insights that you bring. I feel like I'm studying the film industry to learn about the book industry, and you're in publishing, too. But I think that's really, really interesting, at least to
And
me.
we don't have time to talk about all the things you're doing. Who would have thought that a psychologist would end up running a factory that made all
It's
the shelves and everything else for bookstores
to me, it's
and be
all
the
connected.
it's
Yeah.
all and then own their own bookstore. No, it's true. And so thank you. But it's been and the greatest experience for me, and I've had a wonderful time, I'm sure you have too, is just listening to bookstore owners talk about all the minutia of their day. I find it
I
fascinating.
Yeah. I love
Eh,
putting on the lab coat and trying new things. And what I think is unique about this Beyond Bookstore experience is we're trying to get out of our lanes, that we put it in the name, Beyond the Bookstore, uh, to create book culture in a broad way,
Yeah,
and letting the bookstore be central to that. But let's reverberate beyond the walls and make it bigger and better. So
absolutely. It's been great.
yeah,
Let's keep
thanks.
going. Keep on
Yep,
trucking.
we've begun.
All
So
right. I'm going to stop the
okay.
recording.